So as we carry on exploring our contemporary societies and the vital role that women play, it's time now to focus on the fabric of our democracies and the representation of women. In an age of increasing polarization, the digital world in particular is dramatically influencing the shaping of opinions, civic participation, and societal perceptions. How do we navigate these forces while fostering unity? How do we fight polarization to build resilient democracies? For this very important discussion, we are delighted to welcome to the stage Silvana Koch-Mehrin, Sinha, and Shelley McKinley, who will be moderating this session. Ladies, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I think you all, if it's your first time at the Women's Forum, you're in for a real treat. Amazing speakers. I'm Shelley McKinley. I'm the Chief Legal Officer of GitHub, and I'm a Vice President of Microsoft. But I have two amazing ladies with me today. First, we have Silvana Koch-Mehrin, who is the President and founder of Women Political Leaders. It's a global network that's dedicated to increasing the number and influence of women in political leadership. Silvana was previously Vice President of the European Parliament and a member of European Parliament. She brought over a decade of political experience from 2004 to 2014. Before entering politics, Silvana founded a successful public affairs consultancy in Brussels, later expanding its reach to the US. We also have Sinha, who is globally recognized as an advocate for gender equality with over 25 years of experience that she brought to Equality Now, where she strengthens mission-driven organizations advancing gender parity. Mona is passionate about social justice and women's empowerment, and she's empowered over 90 organizations focused on unlocking economic potential and protecting the rights of women, girls, and gender non-conforming individuals. Mona's led initiatives that have catalyzed over $1 billion in funding for projects worldwide, elevating women's economic agency and leadership. She's the board chair of Women Moving Millions and sits on the executive council of the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum, championing governance, strategy, and sustainability. So please join me in welcoming these two amazing panelists. As you just heard, the topic of our panel today is really about the intersection of women and politics and driving change in the world. We all know, I think intuitively, that when women participate equally, it has a massive influence on a country's overall progress and its performance. But we're really data-driven here. As you heard, a lot of data already at the forum. And what's been really interesting about the work that I think, Silvana, I've seen that you've been doing is Women's Political Leadership just put out a study not too long ago that talked about the impact of women in leadership. And as we know, it's been a really tough year for women around the world in politics. Do you want to give us a little bit of kind of the current status on where women are, and incorporating some of that data from this wonderful survey that you've done that I think really helps us put a real fine point on it? How do you see things currently?
Well, sure. Thank you very much, and thank you for making this a topic at such a forum, because what's so crucial is that we as women look at politics as the place where really the decisions are taken for how do we live in our societies, what's wrong, what's right, what's legal, what's illegal. Because very often that's left to the guys. And we still, starting with the bad news, the UN General Assembly is just a couple of weeks ago and sometimes can be described as the most powerful men's club of the world. Less than 10% of the speakers the heads of states, heads of government representing their countries were women. So that's the state of where we are in terms of women's leadership in politics. But on the other side, the good news is that where women are in politics, they drive the change. They change legislation, they change policy. And while we all had that feeling, knowing, okay, a country moves to making gender-based violence something well, declaring it a crime or recognizing it, that women are behind this. Now we have the data evidence, and actually it was just yesterday that this year's report was launched at the annual meeting of the World Bank, and the correlation between more women in political leadership and more change towards inclusive and equal opportunities is very clearly stated. So this is a business case for more women getting into politics.
That's amazing. It's just so important to have that data basis in what we're talking about. You know, we all intuitively know it, but when we see the data, it can be just really shocking. Mona, the world is experiencing so many challenges, just really kind of all at once. There is evidence suggesting that nations with significant female representation are less likely to engage in conflict. Do you think this perspective can help us reshape our approaches to international relations and global peace?
As you mentioned, we all know intuitively that women's leadership helps in creating more sustainable, safer economies, because we are concerned not just about ourselves, but about our communities. And that is a key thing in conflict resolution. We actually have data, plenty of data, the World Bank data, the IMF data, that shows that when women are involved in peacekeeping, those negotiations happen faster, and in fact, they last 15 years longer than the average peacekeeping treaty. So even if you look around the conflict we are seeing today, I'm not seeing too many women in those rooms, and that's something that we need to demand. In terms of policy, and you know, you've heard a lot about AI and digital spaces, etc. Still today, 2.7 billion women are left out of the digital space. So in situations where we're seeing increased violence in the digital space, which is a key reason why women are not engaging in political leadership, this needs to change. So it's not just about the harms of this space, it's also about who's creating the rules that govern it. And in a multi-jurisdictional situation, like the digital space, where laws are created, you know, in situ in local countries to govern local policies, it is very difficult to create these policies and also very difficult to keep up with the pace of change. As you can see, the digital world is changing, I would say, hour to hour, minute to minute. So how do you then create laws that are valid not just for today, but for the future? So if that helps answer your question, even in the space of conflict, we see an increase of sexual violence. We see an increase of undoing of rights and undoing of legal, you know, challenges that women can bring. But unless you have women in the room, I think the perspectives are very skewed.
Let's dig a little bit more into that sort of online issue in terms of really the attacks against women. We've seen, you know, policy campaigns in the UK and the EU to really try to address this, and we know that much of that advocacy came from women's organization. Silvana, can you speak a little bit more about the intersection of online safety and women's political participation?
Well, it's definitely a massive, massive problem, and it's only getting bigger because the possibilities of creating such a hostile and violent environment, they just grow. And that can be, it's harmful in many ways. So it's harmful, of course, for the politician herself, that she every day gets hate messages, gets threats, gets attacks on also her family. And for example, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, one of the reasons that she openly talks about for her to leave office was that the first name of her little daughter was a hashtag that was trending so often in combination with violent messages. And she said, well, I might be able to take a lot, but I can't have this on my kids. Or the foreign minister of the Netherlands, next door countries, I mean, her family was under attack constantly. So these are elements that come as part of being a woman in politics that have exponentially grown. And we, again, know from data that the problem is only getting bigger. We did together with Julia Gillard's Institute, the former Prime Minister of Australia, who herself in her time was also subjected to many attacks. We did a survey on the non-legal barriers for women in politics. Because why is it that at the UN General Assembly there are less than 10% of women speaking, right? Why is it that still more than 75% of the parliamentary seats are held by men? There must be something happening, and online violence was one of the main things. More than 85% of the politicians surveyed said, yes, we experience online violence. But my guess is it's close to 100%. It's just some who just want to ignore it and not look at it and say, I don't let this drag me down. I just ignore that this is happening. I go on with what I do. But again, it's not only about herself, it's about her team, and it's about how are women perceived in the public space. And when you look at the UNDP data, which is very close to the Ipsos data just now, they state that 9 out of 10 people in the countries surveyed, and they did about 85% of the world's population. So 9 out of 10 people, this is men and women, women and men, have serious biases against women's leadership. So, and you think 9 out of 10, this is crazy. I mean, there's countries, there's of course country differences. My guess is in a country like France, it's not 9 out of 10, but still, there's so much that this online violence sort of can base itself on, because it finds these stereotypes that we need to go against online, of course, but also offline, which is a real big task to do.
Yeah, we've certainly seen this play out around the world, and we're of course seeing it now play out big time in the United States, where we have a very important election involving women. The first potential women president of the United States, as we all know. Mona, do you have anything to add to that in terms of?
Yeah, I was going to reflect actually on the US elections, where there have been situations where fake voices of the presidential candidate have been used to reach out to potential voters, which is a real issue. We have seen how she has been doxxed. We have seen around the world, not specifically in the US, but in speaking to former Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, where her image was used falsely. And these images multiply 1 million times an hour. So it's really very hard to control them, and they get more and more dangerous. She started an organization called Christchurch Call, which Equality Now is a part of. And the purpose of that was really to understand the role of AI in perpetuating violence among men and radicalization among mostly young men. And a part of that, as she sees, is this increased level of hate and violence against women's leadership. And I'll posit to say it just comes from an unfound space of fear. There's this fear of being replaced, I suppose, or this fear of, men's power being shifted in some ways. And I'd say for us, talking on this panel and others about healthy democracies, we need those perspectives. We need both sides of the aisle to weigh in, whether it's political representation, whether it's the perspective we bring as men and women, because we learn from difference, and that's what makes healthy democracies. So we're all holding our breath for the election in the US, and hopefully a lot of what we've seen can be mitigated. Just as perspective, with the laws that you're asking about, we are working with the government of Brazil to develop a model law on digital rights. We had developed some guidelines for the Global Digital Compact, which was adopted during the UN General Assembly. And while it's not perfect, it at least gives us some boundaries and some frameworks for the digital space.
Yeah. Can I just add an offline example, because you mentioned Brazil, which for me is an example of what becomes normalized. Brazil had a woman president. I don't want to say if that's a good or a bad president as such, but what was available at the time was a sticker with her face, spread legs, to put on your car where you fuel the car. Right? You can imagine what's the normalization and the sexualization and the sexual abuse normalization of women political leaders, right? And that, I think, is an extreme example that also happens offline, right? And other women see that and say, well, I don't want this. So this is something that shows, I think, the extent to how this sexism is translated also into reducing women in very powerful position.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So
hard enough to bring people to these leadership positions. I think the challenge is how do you make sure they stay there and you can keep them there so that they can add their valuable insights.
yeah, let's talk a little bit about that, because like we know we need women to fuel healthy democracies. We know we don't have enough women. We just heard even more about what these barriers are and how they're playing out in the world. And so let's talk a little bit about like you talked a little bit about the things we do. Maybe Silvana, starting with you, talk a little bit about, what are the things that we need to do? What are the steps that we need to take as a world to start changing the game on this? And then Mona, I would go to you, because I know you've done so much in sort of the enforcement area. Once you get things in, then how do you actually realize them, which is also a struggle that we have. So maybe let's start with you, Silvana, on that.
Sure, very, very happy to. I mean, there of course are different areas of where one needs to take action. One is sort of the workplace itself, making the political institutions places where women really see that they belong there. This starts from working times, how these spaces are designed. When I was in Parliament, I have 2 of my 3 kids while I was in office, and I realized there's no place to change diapers, there's no place to breastfeed. There was a room assigned which didn't have water and far away from the plenary, so totally unusable. And up to date, and we're in 2024, the European Parliament does not have rules on maternity leave. So this is an EU country, and many countries around the world do not foresee that women in politics become mothers, which is is kind of something that politicians all over the world are trying to introduce for any other workplace. But quotas, I have to admit, I'm a firm believer in quotas for politics, because otherwise it will take forever to get to a place where we say now political representatives are actually mirroring societies. So quotas can be different in different countries. And then, of course, the bigger work in society is about how do we change those stereotypes on ensuring that there is knowledge both for men and women, that women make great leaders. Pieces of data are important, discussions and fora like these are important, but we need to also bring this to schools, to places where there are mainly men attending, and to these stereotypes. I mean, Mona is working on this all day as well. They're so sticky and deep-rooted, and they need so many approaches to be changed.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because we talk a lot about stereotypes perpetuated in technology and how we combat that. And I always think stereotypes perpetuated in culture, I mean, as reflected by technology, of course, are just so sticky and so hard to change. You have to start in the beginning. Maybe Mona, to you, as someone who's really worked in this area for a long time and really trying to think about how do we take these great things, all these great thoughts that we have, put them into law, and then ultimately, how do they get enforced? Maybe you want to weigh in on sort of what you see as the future, the status, the future, and the opportunity we have in this.
Yeah. I mean, the good news is we do have an amazing opportunity to write this, because frankly, legal discrimination begins in the family. As we all know, the minute a girl is born, the rules are different. The rules for inheritance are different. The rules for who gets educated is different. The rules of who gets even the right size portion of food in the family is different. So that's where it starts. And then if you look at the life cycle of a woman, there are key pivot points in which these dangers, shall I say, all these discriminatory practices are exacerbated. So when who's going to school, right? When she reaches adolescence or puberty, what happens then? Early marriage because of poverty or because of concern of sexuality coming to the forefront. And then the rights of a woman once she is married. In many parts of the world, she doesn't have any rights unless her husband allows her to have rights, and we know where those are. There's a right to property. There's a right to even passing her nationality to her children. You know, so all of these barriers have been artificially created by people who did not take women as seriously as part of our economy and as part of our society. I mean, if you want to look at economic facts alone, just having gender parity would actually add $28 trillion to the world's GDP. So when you leave women out, there's a real economic cost. Other than it being the right thing to do, it's actually the smart thing to do. In terms of laws, we work around the world to change some of these discriminatory laws. We've changed about 85 so far around the world. And what we've seen is women's increased participation outside of the home, in the home, her right to work, her right to access legal, laws is still a bit of a dream, because the access is not as easy as one would like it to be. And this is where the average human being weighs in, because we work in coalitions where we call it sort of grassroots to the grass tops, because on the grassroots levels, when you advocate for change and you demand change, amazing things can happen. Hold your politicians accountable. Get out there and vote, because your voice really makes a difference in the choices that you have going forward. And if not for you, then for the next generation. So the way laws are reformed is when you have to start setting standards, yeah? We know about precedents, which is why even though Brazil might be a little bit problematic as a government, they have offered to set up and work with us on these digital rights. So let's take a stab at it and one step forward, and then maybe we can have it around the world with the connections that we have with the Christchurch call. But legal change is fundamental, and often I hear people say, yeah, we have a law, but so what? Well, if you don't have a law, there's not even an opportunity to get to so what. So I think people have to change their minds around why policy is important, why electing women who make those policies is important, because they bring a different perspective. And like I said before, having that diversity of opinion around a table is critical in making the best decisions for our economies and our democracies.
Great. Anything to add to that, Silvana?
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I think the coalition between grassroots movements that you work so closely with, who then push against those doors where the politicians sit and decide, is so important, because in hardly any country women have a majority, right? They need to always find those allyships, and having the grassroots as a group of voters, strong group of voters, behind them is really creating that momentum. And then it takes the male champions. I mean, because women don't have the majority in most places, there needs to be male championship and male allyship. And one very short anecdote in Jordan, where we had a global convening a couple of years ago, there's very few women in politics, in parliament, in government. And it was a woman who then tried to change the legal situation of a law which was called Marry the Rapist. So meaning a woman that got raped, the rapist would be walking away free if he would marry his victim. This was the legal situation. And she said, this needs to get changed. And there was very few women in politics, but she had the king then on her side and some other very forceful male voices. So even though there was a very small number of women politicians in parliament who all across party aligned on that, they managed to get this law changed. So this is what I think is crucial to remember, that what you described, the legal change needs to happen so that women know they have the right. But then the implementation is the second step, that is then translating the law and the rightful law into reality.
Yeah, if I can answer that. I think what you say is absolutely correct. We did help change that law, so thank you for bringing that up. Male allyship is really critical. If you watch this film that got nominated for the Oscars last year, To Kill a Tiger, it's a story about sexual violence and rape in a small Indian village, and how a farmer, a poor farmer, stands up for his daughter, who was raped by her cousin and two of his friends at a family wedding. And what's amazing is the repercussions of this film Because the film was shown, obviously it's gotten wide acknowledgement around the world, and he has now begun getting letters from other farmers and men from neighboring villages to say, you were so brave to stand up, and we're ashamed to say we didn't. So now there's a coalition of men in these local small villages around the country, and I posit to say that's going to make the difference.
Great. Well, in our final minute wrapping up, I want to give each of you a quick chance. You're in front of a group of very important, very powerful women in all different stages of their careers and their lives and from around the world. What can we do? What do you think we can do to help advance women in leadership and democracy?
Well, the very simple ask would be, well, consider going into politics. Think of yourself as somebody who could be that candidate that you want to see on the ballot paper. It's not a life sentence. You can do it for a couple of years, make a difference, and then go back into what you did before. But just also being out there, using your voice will make certainly a even bigger difference to the difference that you're already making.
Mona?
Absolutely echo that. And just know that each one of you sitting here is a champion for change. Each one of you wants change. Each one of you believes in gender equality, whether you're male, female, or non-binary. And each one of you can make that change happen. So take that risk, take that first step. It might not seem easy, but with the support of everybody in this room, you can do it.
Well, with that, thank you so much. Thank you from all of us for everything you're doing to advance a healthier society and a more representative one.